but let's get into it. So today we're going to be talking about DC contracts and Addenda. If you don't know me, I'm Rick Bosl. I'm the managing broker here at the Arlington office. And a little bit about my background. I've been licensed since 2003. Most of the time has been with Keller Williams. I'm licensed in all three jurisdictions. And yeah, sold well over 100 million. I haven't updated this in a while. Well over 100 million, over probably closer to 500 transactions and thousands of contracts reviewed. So just some general comments about the contract itself. So pay attention to the dates and expiration times. This is especially true if you're licensed in multiple jurisdictions or you're going to be, because they do vary. And then if you see something in bold typeface, that typically means it's really important, so pay attention to it. And then third, unlike Virginia, some of the documents that go into the contract are completed ahead of time by the listing agent and the seller. And then you'll see there's a part 1 and a part 2 to them. Just some general comments about contracts in general. Typewritten is better than handwritten. Most these days, it's going to be typewritten in DocuSign or something, but handwritten is still perfectly legal. Make sure it's complete. I always like to see a summary page, and then I also send a summary with the email when I send the contract out. So makes you look more professional if you do that. So hit all the highlights. Want to make sure you include all the proper disclosures. Make sure all the pages are in the right order. And if you're scanning, you want to make sure that pages are right sided up and scanned with a high resolution. And then, of course, if the file is too big, you want to reduce it. So I'll try and monitor the. Okay, that's fine if you got to jump off ahead of time. So if you have any questions as we go along, just blurt it out. I won't always be checking the chat. So I like this to be interactive, and we're going to have a few questions as we go along. So as I mentioned, we're going to be going over the DC sales contract and a number of disclosures. So these are documents we're going to cover in this order. These 10 and then another 9 here. And we're going to spend most time on the contract itself. Now in DC, every July forms get updated, and these are the ones that are updated in July. And a couple have been discontinued. One is the financial information form. If you've been practicing for a while in DC, you probably remember that often the seller would ask for a financial information sheet because they want to see if you're, how well qualified the buyer is. Well, is decided that's kind of, it's an impediment to home buying process for some people, especially in marginalized communities. I never liked it because I thought that was a little intrusive, and that's why we have a pre-approval letter. That should be sufficient. But I'm glad to see that they finally got rid of it altogether. So let's jump into the contract itself. I'm going to be switching between this PowerPoint slide and the actual contract. Some things you'll notice, it's the contract itself is a lot shorter than Virginia, but there are a lot more addenda to add on. Conveyances, those are in a separate document, which I kind of like that better than in Virginia. Then you have to, sometimes you have to guess what was conveying with the property or not. Termite inspection, it's automatically included if the buyer wants it. Lead-based paint, there's a federal form and a DC form. Make sure you do them both. I mentioned about time periods. In DC, the time period ends at 6 p.m. And notices and delivery, unlike in Virginia, you don't have to specify what are the acceptable means of delivery. Pretty much you get them all in DC, whether it's email, which is most common, hand delivered, overnight, fax, if anybody uses a fax anymore. But let's jump into the contract and go through this. I've highlighted a few things here. Also, if you want to get a copy of my marked up contract here and a PowerPoint slide, send me an email at the end presentation and include one thing that you learned today.
Can we
So I'd like to
get
start
that?
out.
I'm
Go ahead.
sorry.
Hey, Laylee.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Very good. I'm excited about this. Can we get the whole presentation, even the first page that you were just going by?
Yeah.
Okay.
You'll get all this.
Yes, all of that.
And this. Yeah.
Oh, yes. Okay, thank you.
Yep. So the first thing I'd like to point out is on the very top, time is of the essence. That is a legal term, meaning all the dates are, hard dates. If you miss a date, you're in default. Unlike in certain parts of Virginia, like southern parts of Virginia, they don't have this term in the contract, and the settlement date can be anywhere. It can be a few weeks after the settlement date you put in there. It's on or about that date. But in G-card contract, time is of the essence. So all the dates are hard dates. I apologize if you're hearing any noise from the offices next door to me. I apologize about that. Can't control that team over there. So the first part, you want to identify who the parties are, the property itself. If you're selling a condo, make sure you put in, if there's any parking spaces, the number of the space, and if there's storage in it too. Now this is a G-card contract, and it's used in DC, but also Montgomery County in Maryland. The rest of Maryland uses MAR contracts and some other regional ones. But if you're going to use this contract, you want to either specify which jurisdictional addendum you're going to use to make it specific to that county. Paragraph 3, you're going to be talking about prices and financing. So don't confuse the down payment with the EMD, the earnest money deposit. Two totally different things. And if you're doing a cash deal, you want to put 100% here. And then the most important line here is going to be sales price, right in the price here. 3C is going to specify what kind of financing, if there is any. Now, if you're doing cash, you don't need to write anything here. You don't have to write in cash here. This pretty much explains it when you say 100% down payment. That means cash. So you want to say, is the buyer going to obtain a loan or assume the seller's loan? Now, assumption that's becoming more common these days. In the past few years, you never saw that, but now that interest rates have almost doubled or have doubled since the days of 3%, you're seeing some sellers offering their loan to be assumed. But this only applies for an FHA or a VA loan. And just like if you're going to do an assumption, just like a short sale, there's nothing short about it. Just be prepared. This assumption takes much longer than a usual closing, partly because it's so new, and a lot of the lenders and service providers, they don't know how to handle it. And they don't have to agree to it. Even though the seller might say, yeah, you can assume it, as a service provider, they can still say, 2 months down the road, they can say, no, we're not going to let this loan be assumed. Laylee, you have a question?
Yes. If it is FHA loan, which of the following, or what do we check? Fixed, adjustable?
Well, if it's FHA, you want to check FHA here.
And then what about
And
between So,
Whether it's fixed or adjustable, that's conversation you want to have with your buyer and your lender. These are probably, adjustable rates are starting to see more of those. A couple years ago, it'd be crazy to do anything but, fixed rate when the rates were so low.
let's say it's 30 years long. So it will be adjustable or?
No, you don't specify the term here. You'd specify then in the financing contingency.
If it's conventional, it's also the same way?
Yeah, conventional FHA or VA, you're going to obtain, most likely you're going to obtain it. And then whether it's going to be a fixed or adjustable rate, kind of depends on the situation, the marketplace, how long the buyer plans to be there. If they're not going to be there that long, a few years, adjustable rate might be the way to go.
So always check obtain? Or it's gonna depend?
Most likely you're going to obtain it.
Okay.
Yeah. There are a few assumptions, but it can only be an FHA or VA loan if the seller has that. But those aren't as easy as you might think. So, second deed, you don't see too many of those these days. Well, one case you might see it is if you're going to assume the seller's loan, but you still need to make up the difference, and you want to do a second deed of trust. Then you'd obtain that. Other than that, I don't see too many seconds out there. If you're going to assume the loan, you want to fill this out too. And it's important to know about a VA loan. Anybody can assume a VA loan, but if the buyer is a non-veteran, they can still assume it, but then the seller loses their eligibility until the buyer pays off that loan. So not every seller knows about that.
So if assume, then fill out the other following box.
Say that again?
Like if it's assumed, if it's an assumed loan, then the assumption, which one do we check here on E?
Kind of depends on the loan, and
Okay.
yeah, I mean, ideally, if I was a seller, yeah, I want to be released of liability after that. So I might have to look into the details of the actual loan that the seller has, whether they can release that.
I guess it's gonna depend a lot on the loan information and details. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. Paragraph 4 is for the earnest money deposits. You want to say the amount here and who's going to hold it. At KW Metro Center, we don't hold deposits, so you want to name the title company. In Maryland, it is possible for the broker to hold the deposit, not KW, but you're writing this contract for a buyer and listing agents with a different brokerage. It's possible in Maryland, the broker can hold this deposit, but I'd still recommend having the title company hold it. And unless you have the check in hand, you don't want to check this one. Or actually not even in hand. Unless the buyer has already delivered it to the title company, you don't want to check this box. You want to check the second box. And they are going to deliver it. Typically, I write in 3 days. So. Now, one thing to be aware of is that if the buyer misses the deadline for depositing the EMD, the seller they can void the contract. They can just flat out send you a notice saying contract is void, and that's it. So when you're working with the buyer, you want to stay on top of them and make sure that you get the deposit into the title company. Sometimes the buyers ask me, hey, do I get any interest on it? When it's held, no, you're not going to get any interest. It's probably held in an account that collects interest, but the title company is going to keep any interest.
That deposit is within 7 days, right?
Typically 3 days.
Okay.
Now it does say here, if in Maryland, if the broker's going to hold it, it's got to be deposited within 3 days. So I use that as kind of my guideline.
Yeah, I think DC is calendar days or business days.
It's
I have to
calendar
look.
days. Yeah.
Calendar days. So just be careful if you do 3 days and it's going to fall over a weekend, because sometimes it's difficult to get the escrow to title if.
Exactly. Yeah. Title companies don't always work on the weekends, unlike realtors, so be aware of that. As we all know, the funds are due at settlement. One thing to be aware of, if you're doing an assignment of funds, you need to get written consent ahead of time. I mean, don't just show up at settlement date and say, hey, the buyer's going to use assignment of funds. The seller doesn't have to allow that, and they might not like it. It might not say it. They might not agree to it. So assignment of funds is used when a buyer is doing transactions the same day. So if they're selling one house and then they're buying another house the same day, well, they're not going to get the actual money in their account from the first house until it's recorded, until the deed's recorded at the county, and that could take a day or two. So what they do instead is an assignment of funds, and a title company will say, okay, we're holding the funds and we'll release them to the next party as soon as it's recorded, and you can count on us. So that's what assignment of funds is. I try to avoid that. I mean, if you can, give yourself a little bit of time in between when you're buying more than one property, buying and selling at the same time. Paragraph 6 is where we put an actual, when's the settlement going to be? And put an actual date in here. Don't just write 30 days from from ratification, because that's not always clear. And one overarching goal you want to have in a contract is make everything clear and concise. So put an actual date is much clearer than just writing 30 days from ratification. And you'd also write in the settlement company here. Paragraph 7 talks about property maintenance and condition. I put some stars here. This is a really important paragraph. And something I like to review with my buyers. So, and the seller. So the seller's has to deliver the property vacant. So free of any tenants. Free and clear of trash and debris. So if you show up at the walkthrough and they haven't cleared it out, you go back to point to this. It's got to be broom clean. That doesn't mean it has to be, super clean. They don't have to hire professional cleaners to come through, but broom clean. And then substantially same condition. Now, it doesn't mean identical condition, but substantially the same. So one of the examples I always use are, maybe you go to see the property and some artwork hanging on the wall, and there's, hanging up by nails in the wall. Well, when you go back to do the walkthrough, all artwork is gone, but they left nail holes. Well, the nail holes were there when you saw it, so it's in substantially the same condition. If you're working with a seller, tell them, don't try and patch up those holes, because you could actually make it worse, and you don't have to, according to the contract. Now, of course, if they, in the process, removing some artwork and they end up creating a bigger hole or something, then you might want to repair that, but for the most part, you don't want to. Now it says you're gonna accept, the buyer's gonna accept the property in a condition as of a particular date, either date of offer or date of home inspection. If I'm doing a home inspection, I like to use the date of a home inspection because you really don't know the condition of everything until the inspector goes through with it all. And you have a third option for other, and I really don't know a good situation to use that. So, date of offer, if you're not using a home inspection, date of home inspection if you are. And if you don't select any of them, this says here, you get the date of offer option. Now, if you want to make this contingent upon the home inspection, you want to check this box. This is not the actual home inspection contingency, but you're saying it's contingent upon an inspection. Yeah, Layla, you have a question?
Yes, I guess because I'm doing a lot of FHA, so I know I'm gonna have home inspections eventually with the buyers that I'm working with. So most likely I'm gonna be checking date of home inspection.
Correct.
Okay, and so it's always good to check that box, right? When I'm doing home inspection with FHAs.
Yeah, I like to.
Okay, just wanna make sure.
Yeah, like my reasoning is you don't know the condition of everything until you do the home inspection. So
Okay.
that'd be my choice. And has anybody ever used this other? Anybody give me a reason why you'd want that?
In what moment will you use that, for example?
That's what I'm asking. I don't know an example.
So Rick, a reason may be that there was maybe the property was being renovated prior, during the date of offer, the date of ratification. So you want to put a date that it was going to be completed so that you could go in and just check it
Okay.
to make sure there are no other issues. I'm just guessing something like that.
Yeah, well, that would make sense. Yeah. Okay. Okay, I learned something. Thank you. Other thing to note, unless otherwise specified, the buyer is buying it as is condition. So there's no, years ago, if you've been in practicing long enough, you might remember there used to be certain walkthrough issues that's how it'd be required to fix. We don't have that anymore, so it lays it out. Buyer's buying it as is. Access to the property, that's how it has to give access for appraisals and inspection. And you do the final walkthrough within 5 days of settlement. Now, I always like to do it, I typically don't wait until the day of settlement to do a walkthrough. I like to do at least a day before, just in case you find something, you get time to, work with a listing agent, work out a solution. But if there if there have been major home inspection repairs, you might want to do it, 5 days prior, make sure that's all been done. Paragraph 9, inclusion, exclusion. As I mentioned in DC, there's a separate form that has all this. We'll get to that. Home warranty, if you're going to specify a home warranty or not, and who's going to pay for it.
And that's a buyer's choice, right, Rick, for home warranty. So what if you check yes or no, the buyer decides to get a home inspection afterwards? It's just not part of this contract.
Right, the home inspection or home warranty?
Home warranty, sorry, home warranty.
Well, it's one of the terms of the offer here. So typically, if the buyer says yes, and the buyer's paying for it, I don't think any seller's going to care. But If you're asking the seller to pay for it, that's one of the terms of the contract, so.
As a buyer or a seller, okay, who will usually pay? Let's say I have buyer clients. Is that something that I have to make sure the seller is responsible for, or what? How do you usually do it?
The home warranty?
Yes.
Typically I usually wait until we do the home inspection. I'm not a huge fan of home warranties unless I find somebody like HVAC or hot water heaters are really old and might be on its last legs. But if everything is fairly new and great condition, no real need to get one, I don't think.
So an example of this is obvious. Let's say it's not the case of a new home or with everything new. Usually you will wait for a home inspection in order to actually decide for the home warranty. Is that how it goes?
You can,
Sometimes.
if you know ahead of time that some of the, appliances are really old and, the buyer is, maybe the first time buyer and they're concerned about things breaking the first year, it might be a good reason to get a home warranty.
Okay. So usually,
Sometimes sellers or even listing agents will buy it because they kind of, if there's issues after the sale, they can
who's
try to sue the
responsible?
home warranty company.
Who's responsible? Let's say I have buyers. Who's responsible for the home warranty?
For buying it?
Like I have buyers. I'm working with buyers.
Yeah.
So who will be responsible for the home warranty? The seller would provide it, or would
Well,
they?
that's one of the terms of the contract. You can specify the buyer's going to pay for it or a seller. You can say not to exceed a certain price and who you want it to be provided by. So you as a
Is
buyer
that-
agent, you want to counsel your client on this.
How much is the standard for a home warranty price?
It kind of depends on whether it's a condo or a home. I think at the age, probably around $500 plus or minus.
Okay, and that can be negotiable with
The
the
cost of
seller.
the home warranty? No, I mean the home warranty companies have their products they sell.
No, with the seller and buyer, like who's responsible
Yeah,
for
this
it?
is negotiable. So
Okay.
yeah, as the seller, when they get an offer, they're going to be kind of looking at what the net price is. So they're going to take the sales price minus any, seller concessions, minus the cost of a home warranty, minus any other costs they're looking for. So yeah, this is just one of the terms.
Okay, thank you.
Paragraph 11 states whether the buyer is going to live there as principal residence or not. So if you know the buyer is buying it as an investment property and they tell you to check this box so they can get a lower interest rate, don't do that. That's what's known as mortgage fraud, and that's a felony. You could lose your license for that.
Which one are we talking about? Number?
Buyer representation. This says whether they're going to occupy it as a principal residence or not. So a lender, they want to know, they're going to ask the buyer, hey, you buying this as an investment property or are you going to live there?
Okay, so you gotta always make sure.
Yeah, so,
And you say you can
don't lie.
You can get in trouble if what? If
you lie on this, because
Does that have to do with homestead exemption?
no, this has to do with lenders will charge a higher interest rate to investors rather than owner occupied homes. So don't lie for your buyer. It's not worth it. But typically I'm not going to lie. I'm just throwing an exception out there. They might run into somebody they're not aware of that. Termite inspections. Unlike Virginia, you have to check, whether you want one or not, or who's going to pay for it. In DC, the buyer at the buyer's expense, they have an option to do it. It's already written into the contract. And if you do the inspection, the report comes back and saying there's some damage and termites are still there, the seller has to make the repairs according to what's in the report. So make sure if the inspector notices something, they tell you, maybe it's a home inspector doing the termite inspection too, and they point out and say something to you, make sure it gets written into the report too. Paragraph 13 talks about lead-based paint regulation. So anything built before 1978, federal law, the seller has to complete a lead-based paint disclosure. And in DC, there's also a DC lead-based paint disclosure. And, that blue pamphlet about protect your family from lead in the home that we always have the buyer's initial. Well, federal law requires the sellers provide that. So as a listing agent, be aware you want to have that signed. Because if you don't get it signed, this contract is voidable by the buyer until the buyer acknowledges the lead-based paint form and that blue EPA pamphlet. So how many of you knew that the buyer has a right to void if they don't receive that from the seller? It's a pretty important point to know.
I didn't know.
As an agent.
I didn't know.
Yeah. So there's a lot to be learned when you read the fine details in these paragraphs. Paragraph 14 deals with financing application. Just says the buyer is going to make application within 7 days after ratification. Typically, you're going to have the buyer make application before you even start showing them homes. You want to get them pre-approved. But this also tells you have 7 days after ratification.
Can
They
I,
want to work with another lender.
on lead base, going back to the previous one, if as a listing agent, you gotta make sure you have the pamphlet and it's received by the buyer, right? And this is,
Yeah, when you, as a listing agent, there's 3 things you want to load up. You want to have the federal lead-based paint form. You want to have that EPA pamphlet, and then you also want to have the G-card lead-based paint form. So
Okay.
before you accept any offer, load all these up with the listing so they can download it. But if you receive an offer and these are missing, before you accept an offer, tell the buyer agent, hey, get these things signed. So
It has to be-
don't accept a contract without these.
in what case would the buyer void the contract because they didn't receive the pamphlet?
Yeah, if they don't receive them, the contract is voidable.
Okay, I guess I'm just trying to understand like deeply the whole situation. So they will be able to void the contract because what, the house was built
No,
before that?
if the seller doesn't provide these 3 forms, the
Okay,
federal lead-based paint form, the G-card lead-based paint form, and the EPA pamphlet.
okay,
So as a listing agent, you want to protect your seller and make sure any offer that comes in has those 3 signed. Assuming it's built before 1978.
sure.
Finance application, we talked about that. Damage or loss, risk is with the seller. Title, this is an important paragraph here. So The seller has to issue a title that's good, marketable, and insurable. So if they can't provide that, the buyer doesn't have to buy the property. And if the settlement agent, by settlement date, there's still a lien on the property that they can't get cleared, the settlement days automatically extend to 30 days. So it gives the sellers more time to clear that up. And then if it's still not cleared up after 30 days, the buyer can void the contract. Another important section in here, it says, by signing this contract, the seller is agreeing to sign any affidavits, lien waivers, tax certificates, other documents required by the lender. So this really comes into play with a VA loan. The seller has to sign a VA document. And sometimes if they say, no, I don't want to sign that, well, point to this, saying you already agreed to work with the lender and sign anything. Another important paragraph that comes up, especially with condos, sometimes I was asked just last week that, somebody working with the buyer and they didn't get, they're concerned that the condo docs weren't up to date, and they want to know, hey, if we find a violation, after our, timeline to review the docs are up, what can we do? And I said, well, look at the title paragraph, because it says in here, the seller is going to pay any government special assessments and comply with any orders, notices, violations of any county, local authority, or condominium association or homeowner association. So the seller's agreeing that they're going to pay for any condo violations that's noted in the management report. So don't be concerned that you have to find that within your 3-day review period. The seller still has to pay for that. Possession date, unless otherwise noted, the buyer gets it, takes possession of settlement. And also the seller is agreeing to deliver some keys, fobs, and codes, if any. So I've seen some settlements, you show up and the seller didn't turn over the keys, or maybe doing a split settlement and left it with another settlement company, but they have to give keys to the buyer. Various fees, this talks about different settlement fees. Broker's fee, that's how you get paid. Just instruct settlement agent to pay the broker compensation according to a listing agreement. Adjustments, everything is going to be prorated down to the date of settlement. And the main things are going to be if there's any rents, taxes, condo fees, water and sewer charges. Those are the main things. And for calculating purposes, the buyer owns it the day of settlement. There's no half days or anything. Let's see what else.
There's not 20, oh no, never mind.
Default. So if either side defaults, usually it's the buyer that would default, but not always. If the buyer fails to complete settlement for any reason other than default by seller, they're in default. And then when they're talking about the deposit, they're talking about the earnest money deposit that may be forfeited as liquidated damages. So liquidated damages, that's the legal term, and that means, how do I explain it? So, in case where you really can't determine what the true cost would be for, if for default or something, we'll just set this money aside and say, for all the things we can't determine the exact cost, we're just gonna say it's worth this amount of liquidated damages. Now, if the seller, the buyer defaults and seller decides they want to take the deposit as liquidated damages, then that's the end. They can't pursue it any further. But the seller, they can say, no, I'm not going to take the deposit. I'm going to pursue you in court for more. So deposit may not be the limit of the buyer's liability. So the reason I point that out is I don't want you telling your buyers, hey, the most you're going to lose is your, $3,000 earnest money deposit. No, they can lose a lot more if they default. The seller doesn't have to accept that. They can pursue you for more. So it's unlikely they'll pursue more, but yeah, it is possible. So when you're counseling your buyer on, what's at risk, don't tell them that, hey, you're not going to lose more than your EMD. It's the buyer's option. If they default, they can pursue you for more. Now, the seller, if the buyer defaulted and the seller wants an earnest money deposit, it's not just sitting in the bank account that they can just withdraw the funds. No, both parties have to execute a release of deposit, and then whoever's holding the EMD, typically the title company, they can release them. Now, if and it happens, one party refuses to sign, and then the deposit just sits with the title company. You have to go to court to get it released. Well, if you go to court and the judge says, the party that refused to execute the release when they should have, well, then that party's also going to pay legal expenses. So, if one of the parties, you're working the buyer or seller, maybe the seller, and they don't want to sign the release because they thought, they shouldn't have backed out for a home inspection or whatever. So they don't want to sign it. Let them know, hey, if you don't sign it, you're going to end up spending a lot more on legal expenses too, when you should have. Let's see what else. Legal requirements, as you should know, all contracts and addendum have to be in writing to be enforceable. So don't go by just any verbal agreements. Always get in writing. And remind your clients that you're a real estate agent. You're not an attorney, tax advisor, lender, appraiser, surveyor, structural engineer, molder, air quality expert, or home inspector. And don't try and pretend to be one, especially an attorney. Assignability, this contract may not be assigned without written consent. So assignment is a lot of wholesalers will do this. They'll get a property under contract and then they sell that contract to another party. They'll take anywhere from $5,000 to $100,000 as an assignment fee, even though they never go to settlement, they never take possession of the property. They're assigning that to another buyer. Well, with this contract, you can't do that without written consent of both parties. Paragraph 28 talks about FIRPTA. That's acronym for foreign investment in real estate property tax something. But what it says is for a foreign seller, the title company has to withhold a certain amount of money to make sure that any taxes have to be paid. And it, what? Is everybody still here?
Yes,
Yeah, okay. I don't know what that, you can still see my screen?
yes,
Okay. I'm not sure what that pop-up was. So it defines what a foreign person is. Not limited to this, but this pretty much covers them all. Non-resident alien, foreign corporation, foreign partnership, or trust from the state. So one thing I learned is somebody with a green card, they're not considered a foreign person. And if you have any questions, especially in DC, a lot of international people coming and going. If you're not sure, reach out to the title company and ask them. Couple definitions. So as mentioned before, is days, is that calendar days or business days? It's calendar days, unless otherwise specified. So there might be some addenda, they might mention business days. But unless it actually says business days, it means calendar days. And as I mentioned, time period ends at 6 p.m. Yeah, and always check your calendar when you're writing in the settlement date, because if you write in a date and it falls on a Saturday, Sunday, or a holiday, well, then the settlement is actually the prior business day, usually a Friday. So you don't want your buyer to be caught by surprise. Notices and delivery, unlike in Virginia where you have to specify all the means of delivery, in DC you don't have to. You get them all. Yeah, here it specifies it here.
Can you on notices and delivery? So in Virginia, you say you have to what exactly? So to be more specific.
No, in Virginia, you have to specify what are the acceptable means, like email, you always want to check that box. US mail, hand delivery. But in DC, you don't have to specify, you get them all here.
Okay.
So it says here, delivery means sent by wire and electronic medium, which means email or fax. And you also, if you send by email, you also want to include the attachment, actual copy of the executed contract. You should also hand carry it, send by overnight delivery, US postal. So all those are acceptable means.
Okay.
Yeah. And this is all informational purposes, but try and fill it out as completely as you can. Okay, as I mentioned, I might have a few questions as you go along. So here's the first question. So where do you specify the seller subsidy? Is it on a sales contract, in a financing paragraph, financing addendum clauses A, or a separate addendum? So in Virginia, it's right there on page 1. Where do you think it is for the DC contract?
It's a C.
See? It is. Yep, we're going to get to that in a minute.
I guess. I mean, I remember I did something about the clauses, so that's why.
That's good. Good guess. Okay, how far in advance can the buyer do the final walkthrough? 3 days before settlement, 5, 7, or 10 days?
Walkthrough.
Mm-hmm.
Should be 5 days.
Correct. Good memory.
I'm trying to write down, but okay.
If the buyer is late with the EMD, the seller can void the contract. Is that true or false? I heard something there.
True.
True. Mhm.
True. So make sure you get your buyer gets the EMD in on time. Where do you request a termite inspection? Addendum clause A or B, sales contract, or home inspection addendum?
I'll guess on D.
No,
Okay.
it's written into the contract, paragraph 12. they automatically get the contingency if they want to do it.
Wait.
Where do you specify, what's that?
No, it's fine. I'm just gonna, so.
Yeah.
keep going.
Where do you specify where and how to send notices? Addendum clauses A, sales contract, you don't. See paragraph 30 in the sales contract, or notice delivery addendum.
30, paragraph 30.
What'd you say?
You say, where do you specify where and how?
Yeah, A, B, C, or D. What would you
Yeah.
use?
I think it's C.
Correct. Yeah, we just went over that, so you don't have to specify the means, you get them all. Okay, let's look at the seller disclosure statement. Unlike in Maryland, you don't have a disclaimer option. This should be filled out by the seller, not by the agent, so don't fill it out for them, even if they're 90 years old and blind and have trouble filling it out. Have them have somebody else fill it out, because you don't want to be caught up in any litigation that comes about because something wasn't disclosed, and the seller says, "Well, I didn't fill that out," so make sure the seller fills it out. It's not a warranty, and it's not a substitute for a home inspection. So a couple things to point out. Seller's disclosure, it's only for 1 to 4 residential dwelling units. So if you have a 5-plex or more, this doesn't apply. That's for any sale, or if there's a lease with an option to purchase, then you need to do a disclosure. And there are a few situations where the seller does not have to complete it. Mainly any foreclosure, they don't have to do a disclosure. Or if it's an estate sale, somebody's administering the estate or guardianship or conservative or trust, they don't need to. And new construction, they don't fill out this disclosure because they have their own set of disclosure rules they have to meet. So when does the seller have to be provided? Before or at the time you execute the contract. So as a listing agent, and if I put the disclosure up online and somebody sends a contract without it, I'm not going to ratify it until they sign off on it. Because if we go down to paragraph 6, what's the remedy if they don't provide it? Well, the seller can terminate the contract and have up to 5 days after they receive it. So don't fall into that trap. It also talks about what they need to disclose. So if your seller doesn't know for sure, there's an option there for unknown for all of these. Tell them only check the things you actually know about. If it doesn't apply, just check NA. Now, what happens if, maybe they fill out disclosure when you took the listing agreement, it's been on the market for a couple months, and then you finally get on a contract, and then you find something changed. Well, that's okay, because it says right here, if something changes after delivery, the inaccuracy should not be grounds for terminating the transaction. So it's still good. And just remember that as when you're working with a buyer, that disclosure is just snapshot in time for the time they fill it out. Things could change after that. So it asks, when they owned it to and from, and have occupied the property, and whether it's condo or not. If it is a condo co-op, any of the common elements they don't need to disclose anything about. But If you haven't seen one before, you'll see, it's pretty inclusive and pretty much cover everything in the property. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but now as a buyer agent, you also want to look through this. It's your responsibility to look out for your buyer. So if anything weird jumps out at you, you want to investigate a little bit further and ask about it. Yeah, so that's it for the disclosure. So back to the question. So following transactions are exempt from disclosure, except which one of these is not exempt? Court order transfer, foreclosure sale, limited service listing, transfer between family members. I'll help you out here. It's C. The fact that it has limited service listing has nothing to do with whether the seller needs to disclose or not. Okay, as I mentioned, as I point out in the contract, what's included in the sale is actually specified on a separate document. That's the inclusions and exclusions form. So this is complete by the seller, and you could help them also as a listing agent. And there's a part 1 and a part 2 to it. And what I kind of like is it kind of removes the guesswork about what's included, because like in, how many times in Virginia you go to write the offer and then you're trying to remember like how many ceiling fans are in the property. Well, this has it all laid out. If it's not loaded in the MLS, you want to ask a listing agent for it. So Layla, do you have a question?
Yes, on the previous statement about exempt.
About,
Yeah, so the following transactions are exempt from disclosure. So can you give details about the ones that are exempt? Court order transfer, foreclosure
yeah,
sale?
so we look at paragraph 3 in the disclosure statement.
Okay,
Yeah, these are all the cases where the seller does not need a complete disclosure statement. Court order transfer, transfers a mortgagee by a mortgager in default. Any foreclosure. Transfer by, if somebody's selling the person's estate, they don't know anything about the property, so it only makes sense. They shouldn't be required to fill out a disclosure. So yeah, all these are not, they don't need to complete it. I don't have any more details than that. Are you looking for more or?
no, that's good.
Okay. So let's look at the inclusions, exclusions. Yeah, so this should be coming from the seller and listing agent, and they're going to mark everything that conveys with the property, and if there's more than one, then you write in the number. If there's only one, you can leave that blank. It also says up here, any window shades and blinds and window treatments all convey, in brackets for electronic components. It also says, unless otherwise agreed to, all service or wall-mounted electronic components do not convey. So the wall-mounted TV does not convey, but the wall-mounted TV bracket does convey. And one other thing I'd point out here is you'll notice it doesn't say anything about smart devices. In Virginia, the Virginia form does, they do have a little section about smart devices do not convey, but DC, it's, it's silent on that. So an example would be, the reason I raise that question is since it's kind of vague, and this you want to specify whether it does or does not convey, like a Nest thermostat. Some people might consider that a wall-mounted electronic component, which does not convey. Other people might consider that as part of the HVAC system, so it does convey. So, a Ring doorbell, does that convey, or is that considered a wall-mounted electronic component? That does not convey. So, any if you run into anything like that, any smart devices you're unsure about, just specify it. Say it conveys or not, because you don't want to. What you want to avoid is to show up at the final walkthrough and the buyer's expecting all these things like the Nest thermostat and the Ring doorbell, and they're not there because the seller thought, well, they didn't have to convey it. And I bet next year they're going to revise this, and it'll probably have that. Yeah. So like I said, this is coming from the seller. So the seller's going to sign this at the listing agreement, and then to make it part of the contract, they're going to fill out this part. The buyer's going to sign it, and then after the buyer signs it, the seller's going to sign it again on the left side. Any questions on that form? If not, let's look at the addendum of clauses A. So there's addendum of clause A and a B. A has some of the more common and important contingencies, as where you specify any seller credits. Also has a home inspection contingency and a radon, and the as is contingency. Oh wait, did I miss this? No. Yeah, I jumped over this. So this is the jurisdictional addendum for DC. Once again, this one is signed in two parts. You have a part one signed at the time of listing, and then you're going to have a part two where the buyer is going to sign it. Now it also has a paragraph here for seller disclosure. And you're saying hereby acknowledge receipt of the same. So if you didn't receive it, don't check yes. And if it doesn't apply, then check not applicable. But be aware of this. Don't give away your buyer's rights. One other thing I want to point out, well, two things actually. Paragraph 2 talks about DC soil disclosure. Most people have no idea what type of soil their house is on. So somehow I found this website that has a map, and you can actually see. So this link here I put in the contract, but if you zoom in here, it's color coded so you can find where your property is, and come down to the key here. And this lists different types of soil. So I really have no idea what some of these are, but these are official types of soil you'll find in DC. So here's the link for the map. You can look up any property in DC and find out what kind of soil and write it in. So paragraph 3, this talks about tenancy. One thing I want to point out, seller has to represent it is or is not subject to an existing residential lease or tenancy. And what I want to point out is somebody could be a tenant and not have a lease. They could be living there without a lease. And the important qualifier is, were they there when the seller decided to sell? I've had some sellers, they have tenants living and they want to sell the property, and I tell them, let's wait until the tenant is out before we sign the listing agreement. So then this is not going to apply. This is less of an issue now, because then we get into the whole issue of topo laws, which have been changed quite a bit in 2018, which pretty much exempted most single-family accommodations. But if you're dealing with some of the 2 or more, you want to pay careful attention to this paragraph. So this is part 2. This is filled out, the buyer when they're going to write the offer, and then the seller signs once again after the buyer signs. Okay, let's look at addendum clauses A. This has some of the important contingencies. The first one is the seller credit. So if the buyer is going to be asking the seller for any closing cost credit, this is where you'd put it in. Either a dollar amount or a percentage. For most loans, you can't get more than, the lender won't accept more than 3% back. I think VA, I think you can ask for a little bit more, but most loans 3% is the max. And don't forget to check the box and have the buyer initial. And the principle of either use it or lose it applies. So if you're asking for 3% and closing costs only come to 2.5%, well, the seller gets that other 0.5%. So make sure you have a way to use them all. When I was saying about if you're buying a condo or an HOA or a co-op, you can pay the monthly fees up to a year in advance. And that's a good way to make up for any excess funds. So the home inspection. So if you're going to do homes, yep.
Sorry, how do you write that in there? You just put in an amount? You can put in a dollar amount
Yeah.
for the condo fees for up to a year in advance? Okay.
Oh, no, as for the condo fees, no, you just use that, work with the title company, have that on the HUD-1, instruct them to pay it in advance.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't necessarily put that in the seller credit?
No, because you don't know what you don't know what the buyer closing costs are going to be.
Right.
No. And then you either put a dollar amount or a percentage. Don't write them both, because then it's just adds to confusion, especially if the price changes. You negotiate a price or something. So one or the other, not both. Okay, for DC, if you're going to do the home inspection, this is where you would. This is the actual contingency. Now, one thing to keep in mind that in DC, you have the option to right to negotiate or right to cancel. And if you want them both, you need to check both of these boxes. Okay. Or I guess if you fail to select either, then you get them both. But I've seen it happen before where the buyer only selects right to negotiate. They do an home inspection and they want to cancel. It's like, well, no, you don't have that option. You didn't check the box. So remember that in DC, you have to check them both if you want them both. So you have a, home inspection deadline here, so many days. And then if you want to negotiate, then you have to send a copy of the report together with the home inspection notice to the seller. So don't just send the notice, because that won't do it. You have to send both. And then the way the negotiation works in DC for home inspections, there's no real endpoint. This can come ping pong back and forth unlimited times. And usually you're going to work something out, but there's no end date to it. Not like in the NVAR contract where it has a certain number of days for negotiation period. This doesn't. So this can go on and on. So the buyer sends a copy of the report to home inspection notice. Seller can make a counteroffer. And then within 3 days, the buyer can make another offer. And then another 3 days, the seller can make an offer. So we can go back and forth, back and forth. Now, if you don't respond within 3 days, then this results in acceptance by both parties. And just remember that when you're negotiating, that you want to pay attention to those timeframes. And the only way to bring this to an end, if there's no end in sight, is so either party can deliver a notice to the other one saying either you accept my last offer or this contract is void. That's, I mean, you got to have some way to bring this resolution if it's going nowhere. So just be aware, it works a little bit different in DC than Virginia. And we'll get to the home inspection notice in a minute. Another important provision is as is. So I hate to see in a contract, somebody just hand writes in, property sold as is, even though it already says that in one of the paragraphs. When you handwrite it in, well, as is means different things to different people. So that's why we have this paragraph to help specify exactly what you mean by as is. So you check all that apply, maybe you just want to strike out, anything pertaining to the termite paragraph. Or deliver it, maybe it's full of junk, so seller doesn't want to clear it out, and the buyers want to accept that, so you check the first box here. And then another one here, and I'd be a little cautious if I was a buyer, especially buying into a condo or HOA. You check this, and then the seller doesn't have to comply with any violations they might have created. They still have to have smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors installed and operational. And if you want to do a radon inspection, this is where you specify, and it's going to work the same way as roughly the same way as a home inspection, although some of the timelines are specified here. If there's any disclosures to make about relationships, maybe you're helping your mother buy a place, you got to disclose that. There's a section here for additional provisions, and be cautious about what you write because you're not an attorney, so you don't want to be practicing law, so keep that to a minimum. And well and septic just says there's a separate addendum for that. Let's see, did I have any questions for that? Yeah, so home inspection, you can select which one is right. Right to negotiate, right to cancel, or both.
Both.
I hope I made that clear that you can select them both. Once you send a home inspection report and home inspection notice, you lose the right to cancel. It's kind of a trick question. So yes, you lose the right, but if it goes on and on, there is a way you can like kind of force the seller to avoid, just make an outrageous offer that they're not going to accept. And then next time around, you say, hey, either accept my last offer or the contract is void. So in DC, home inspection negotiation period is how long? 3 days, 10 days, indefinite, specified in the inspection paragraph.
It said in 3 days, I forgot.
Yep, I hope I made it clear it's indefinite. You can go back and forth, back and forth. Home inspection contingency. So this is it's kind of both. It's a notice and an addendum. So let's look at it. I think it's probably the only form I know that can be either a notice or an addendum. So as you know, a notice is unilateral. Just one party sent it, doesn't need to be signed by the other. Whereas an addendum is amendment to the contract and both parties have to sign it. So this can be either or. So along with the home inspection report, you're going to send this notice and you're going to ask for, if you're going to ask for repairs, you put them here. And if you're going to void the contract, you would check this box. And this is where it becomes just a notice. You're canceling the contract. But that's a couple other things to point out here. So it says all repairs can be performed in good workmanlike manner. So this doesn't mean by a licensed contractor. Maybe the seller's going to do it himself. And you're going to list all the things you want fixed here, and you want to number them, which I'll get to in a second. Now, if the seller is going to offer you a credit in lieu of repairs or instead of repairs, that's going to go on a separate addendum. Because a lot of times lenders don't like to see, credit in lieu of repairs because they want to protect their interests. They want to make sure if they buy something they need to foreclose on it, that everything's in good shape. So if you had something you wanted, like a plumbing issue or an electrical issue that you want to make sure that's done by the actual contractor, electrician or plumber, what do you think you would do? Well, the answer is you come down to page 2 here. And for anything that you want a licensed contractor to do and receipts for, you're gonna, number them here. Because that says this will be repaired, replaced, or otherwise rectified by licensed contractor, and seller will provide receipts. So you're just gonna write the numbers of the items that you listed here. That's why it says please number each item. So if you want, maybe you got 10 items here, but only 1, 2, and 3 need to be done by actual contractor, you just write the numbers here. Is that clear?
Yes.
Who determines whether a contractor has to do this? Is it typically the buyer or is it usually the agent?
Well, this is something you negotiate. If it's, for me, if it's anything that's electrical or plumbing related, I want a contractor do that. It's replacing a screen. Yeah, I don't care if the seller does that, or a handyman. But if it's something important that you want to see the actual receipts and make sure it's done right, yeah, I'd ask for a contractor.
So you would, as an agent, encourage your buyer to ask for a contractor on specific items. Is that correct? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah. I mean, this is all negotiable. Maybe the sellers, they've done a lot of work on the property and they feel like they're pretty handy and they can they feel like they can replace a ceiling fan or replace a certain light fixture. So, well, it all depends what it is, but anything major, yeah, I want a contractor to do it. So we talk about that. So addendum clauses B has some lesser used ones because sale of home contingency, settlement of buyer's property, backup offers, post settlement AC and pool inspection, which is kind of unique. Yeah, appraisal contingency not to be used with the financing contingencies. So let's look at these. So sale and buyer's property. So, you know, if you need to make the purchase contingent upon the buyer selling their current house, you'd want to use this contingency here. Now, the seller, they can continue to market the property and accept, you know, backup offers. And if the seller does accept another offer and it's, you know, past the deadline here, well, the seller can come back to the buyer and say, hey, I get another offer, I'm going to kick yours out unless you remove this contingency and you have, you know, a certain number of days to do it. That's what the kick out refers to. Paragraph B, now specifies you're going to have it listed within 3 days and you have to give a price. So the past 3 years, we haven't seen this used. Now the market's shifting and you're going to see it come into play a little bit more. So if you're going to use this, you want to make sure that you price it right. If you're going to be selling the buyer's house, you want to make sure it's priced to sell. As a listing agent, if you get this, you want a couple things you want to do. You want to do a little homework on who the listing agent is going to be for the buyer. Typically, it's going to be the same person that's writing this offer. You want to see what their track record is in that neighborhood. You want to come up with a ballpark of what you think the house should be priced at. You want to see, you know, is that the right price or not? So there's a lot of moving parts to this, and you got to do a little homework behind it. As a buyer's agent, if you're going to be using this, you want to be able to sell that. Hey, I know how to sell the buyer's property, and this is why I'm pricing at this price. Here's the comps. Here's CMA I did. You know, I'm going to get it sold. So you're going to have to do, you know, a little show and tell on your part while you're a listing agent that can get that done. So once a buyer does get a contract on their house, then they can remove this contingency by giving the seller a copy of the ratified contract. But it also has to be free of other contingencies other than financing, along with a conditional commitment letter for financing. So don't send them a contract that still has a home inspection contingency active. It doesn't cut it. Now, once you remove it, you know, some agents worry about, well, what if a contract falls through? Like, that's okay, you're protected, because Section D here, it says contract will remain contingent upon settlement of the buyer's property. So it still has to go to settlement. Now, paragraph 2 is settlement of the buyer's property contingency. And I wrote in here, don't use number 2 if you're using number 1 above. You only use one or the other. You use this one when you already have the buyer's property under contract, but you need to make sure it goes to settlement before you buy the next one. So once again, you use this one if the buyer's property is not under contract or not even on the market. Use this one if it's already under contract and you need to go to closing before you can buy the next one. Paragraph 3 is if you're going to use a if you're gonna make this offer a backup contract. So maybe buyer found a house they love, but there's a contract on it. And the buyer wants to write a contract anyways, to be first in line, you'd use this paragraph. Now, what it means for a contract to be a backup contract is you still negotiate everything, you ratify everything, and then you add this paragraph 2. So some agents think that a backup offer, the listing agent is going to hold it until something happens to the primary, and then they'll call you back and you work out a deal. No, that's not what a true backup offer is. A true backup, everything's negotiated, buyer and seller sign a contract is normal on a price and home inspection, everything else. But it doesn't become the primary until the first one falls out. And the reason why you'd want to use that is if the first one falls out, this immediately becomes active contract. You don't have to go back and renegotiate. You don't have to go back on the market. It just becomes a primary right then. Paragraph 4, if the seller needs to find another house before they can go to settlement, they would use this contingency. I'm not seeing this too much these days. A couple of years ago in the crazy markets, and then sellers had the upper hand, and they use that more often. If you want to do a lead-based paint inspection, you use this contingency here. In my 20 years of doing real estate, I've only had one buyer want to do an actual inspection. Third-party approval. This is not for short sales, but if for whatever reason there's a third party and needs to approve something, you would use this paragraph. If your commission is being paid by the buyer, specified here, I guess you can maybe use this if you're using a FSBO or something. Post an AC or swimming pool inspection. This is kind of unique in that you can have a contingency that survives after settlement for the air conditioning and pool. It's hard to test the AC in this kind of weather, so if your buyer is buying something today in DC, but you want to make sure the AC is working, when the weather gets warmer, you can use this contingency. So a couple of things to note is they have to do the inspection no later than May 31st. And remember what I said about anything in bold typeface? It's kind of important. So if you're going to use this, the buyer's agreeing not to use the AC until they actually do the inspection. So if, maybe they got the inspector lined up to come out April 15th, get a really hot day in March, and the buyer turns on AC, well, they just cancel this contingency. So if he operates it before the system is checked out, and the seller's off the hook. And as a listing agent working with seller, I might be leery of accepting something like this. Because several months can go by and you might not, you don't know what kind of condition the AC is in, but if they do accept this, just be aware that the seller is going to be responsible for fixing anything. Even though the seller might think, oh, I used it last summer, everything was fine, I don't care, I'll do this. Well, the following spring comes along, they test it, and 6 months went by and now it's not working. Well, the seller's going to have to pay for it. (1031) exchange. Just going to specify if the buyer is doing it or the seller is doing it. Or if they're both doing it, specify that here. Not a big deal, it just means there's some extra paperwork. Appraisal contingency. So it says not to be used with conventional FHA or VA financing. The only time you do this is if you have a cash deal and the buyer wants it. Most people, buying for cash, they're not going to, rarely going to do the appraisal, but if they did want to do it, this is where you'd specify it. And then pre-settlement, post-settlement occupancy, those are separate addendums we'll get to. Let's see if I had any questions on that. So pool and AC inspection, all contingencies end at settlement, true or false. We just covered that. The pool and AC contingency can go beyond settlement date. Okay, let's look at the conventional financing. I didn't include the VA or FHA because they work in a similar fashion. With the conventional financing addendum, so the specified financing is going to be what you specify here and what you put on page 1 of the contract. So whether you're going to obtain or assume first deed of trust, buyers are going to make a written application within 7 days. This is going to repeat what you have on page 1, percentage of sales price, like 80% or so. And this is where you specify the term of the loan. 30 years is pretty typical, whether it's fixed or adjustable, and how much. So it's a more bold typeface. So alternate financing. This contingency doesn't apply to alternate financing. What is alternate financing? Anything that's different than what you specified here and on page 1. So maybe you specified conventional loan, obtaining one over, fixed rate over 30 years. But then your buyer decides, no, I think I want to go with an adjustable rate. Well, that'd be alternative financing. Yes, the buyer can still go that route if they want, but this contingency won't apply. So if they get denied financing, they can't use this contingency to get out. I think somebody asked in a meeting today whether an assumption is alternate financing. And the answer is yes. If you didn't specify that it's going to be assumed, then that's alternate financing. So another important point to note is seller's option to void. So buyers are going to have a deadline here, 21, 30 days, 25 days after ratification to get their financing in order and to provide a conditional commitment letter for financing to remove it. Well, if they don't do that by deadline, the seller can void the contract. You send a notice to the buyer saying this contract is void because you didn't provide the conditional commitment letter, and that's it. This is works a little bit different in Virginia. The seller has that option to send a notice to the buyer, but it doesn't automatically void the contract. It gives the buyer 3 days to void if they want. So it's a little softer there. Here in DC, it's hard. So if you don't remove it by the deadline, the seller can void the contract outright. So keep that in mind. That's an important thing to keep in mind when you're working in different jurisdictions. Know how the financing contingencies work. Financing rejection. So if the buyer gets turned down financing by the lender that they applied to for financing, then they can use this contingency and void the contract and get their deposit back. The 7-day rule is important. So Buyers needs to make written application within 7 days of ratification. So, maybe they got an approval letter from lender one, then they get this under contract and they apply for financing with lender number two, but they do it within the first week, and lender number two turns them down. Well, they can use that letter to get out. Now, if they went to lender three after, say, on day 15, and lender three turned them down, that's no good. It's got to be one of the lenders they applied to within the first 7 days, or or prior to writing the offer. So don't have your buyers switching around to too many lenders after contract ratification. This is where you specify an appraisal contingency. If they want it, you say yes or no, how many days. Typically you want that to line up with the financing days. If appraisal comes in lower, well, the buyer can proceed at lower price, or if they want to negotiate that, they need to send this appraisal notice to the seller. We'll get to that in a second. What else we got? Yeah, so let's jump to the appraisal notice. So appraisal comes in low and the buyer wants to negotiate the price down. You'd want to use the second paragraph here. So send them the appraisal, tell them what your proposed price is, and hopefully they sign off on it. Let's see if I had anything. Couple things that changed in July. There's no back and forth language. Yeah, so if they want to negotiate the price, they enter it in a 3-day negotiation period. It's written in there as 3 days. And if the seller doesn't want to accept that, then the buyer can void the contract. Question for you. So the buyer can switch lenders anytime and still retain the protection of financing contingency. True or false? The answer is false. You can't switch at any time. They can switch lenders to a lender they made application within 7 days. But if it's past 7 days, no, they lose the protection. There's an option for automatic extension of the financing contingency, true or false. The answer is false. There's no option. It automatically extends. But keep in mind that once you get past that deadline, the seller can void the contract. And speaking of which, if a seller sends a notice of void after the contingency period, the buyer has 3 days to remove the contingency or the contract becomes void. The answer is false. Once the seller sends that notice, contract is void. That's it. Let's talk about the escalation clause. I'm not seeing as many of these as I did past few years, but they're still out there. So keep in mind, you only want to use it when you know you're competing against another offer. So if you're the first offer, you don't necessarily have to send this along. Remember, you can always include it, at a future date. So you have it ready, and when you hear of another offer, you can talk to your buyer and say, hey, do you want to pull the trigger? Do you want to include this or not? Because remember, by giving an escalation, you're kind of showing your hand how high your buyer is willing to go. So let's look at a quick, kind of works the same way, escalating factor. Says if there is a competing offer, we're gonna, match it and add whatever you want to put it, or $1,000, 2,000, 5,000. Don't put it $1. I'll just piss everybody off. So make it a sizable amount. And then you want to cap it not to exceed a certain price. Now, one thing to keep in mind is like, well, how do you know there's a competing offer that you're competing against? And it says here, the seller will provide sufficient documentation to justify it. It's kind of ambivalent. I'd want to say at least the first page of a document. But unlike Virginia, where the seller has to give the full copy of the other offer, DC, they just have to give sufficient documentation. So keep that in mind. And then have a couple options here. Do you want to keep the appraisal or the loan amount stays the same, or what's going to change? One thing that's a little bit unique about this one is that it says here, if it's used, it says, both parties will go back to page 1 and write in the escalated price and initial it. And once they do that, then this contingency is terminated. Actually, it's removed from the contract. It's only used to get, in a way, you're just negotiating a new price. And you write that new price on page 1, have everybody initial it, and then the escalation addendum is gone. I also think it's a good practice in Virginia and Maryland, if you use an escalation, go back and make the change to page 1 also, have all the parties initial it. Sometimes when you send a contract to a title company or lender, they don't look beyond page 1 and they might get lost that there's an escalated price. Okay. Question about the escalation clause. If the seller uses the escalation clause, the listing agent has to provide a copy of the complete contract that was used to escalate against. True or false? Anybody want to guess? The answer is false. Remember, they just need to provide sufficient documentation. If a seller uses the buyer's escalation clause, the price is set and the buyer does not need to sign or initial anything more. False. They have to go back to page 1 of the contract and write in the new price and everybody initial that. Tennessee addendum. I think I'm going out of order. Let's talk about the disclosure of brokerage relationship. If there's this one's kind of confusing because if there's 2 agents involved, there's going to be 2 of these forms, and it's going to be signed by the agent. By the other party that's not represented by, the agent here. So if you're the listing agent, you're going to, put your name and firm here, and then you can check that you're representing the seller. And then it's the buyer that's going to sign that they acknowledge that. And then if the buyer has an agent, the buyer's agent is going to fill out the same form and then have your seller sign one. So it's kind of odd that the person not being represented signs the form. And then we also have one for dual and designated representation. So if both agents are from KW Metro Center, that'd be designated agency, and all parties have to acknowledge that and agree to it. And you're representing both sides. It'd be dual representation, and both parties need to agree to that also. I would recommend staying away from dual representation. You're just asking for trouble when you do that. I like to say dual representation really equals no representation, because you're really limited on, you really can't advise either party. So you're, really just kind of a paper pusher at that point. It's better to just represent one side, let the other side go unrepresented, and you can still help them fill out the contract, just can't give them advice.
Is that the same for also rentals? Like, let's say the rental client wants to have a listing place and you have a rental client looking for a place?
Yeah, if you're a listing agent on a rental listing, most of the time the renters are not going to have an agent. So, but you can still fill out the lease and help them complete the transaction, but it doesn't mean you have to represent them.
But for rentals, I mean, they would like, some clients like to list the rental place when it's available, right? Put it on the by MLS, right? So it's an agent that does that, right?
Yeah, if you're a listing agent, you're representing the landlord.
Okay, and then if you get a client, so that means that's a dual representation. You have the client and you have the listing rental.
So if you have a tenant also,
Yeah,
you can do it. I just recommend not doing it.
got it.
I mean, you can still, if you're worried about how much money you're going to get, you can still get the full commission,
Okay,
depending on what's in your listing agreement. But
sure.
and kind of move quickly through these next few forms. So condo and co-op resale addendum is another one of those forms that's part of it is filled out by the seller, during the listing agreement. And then part 2 is going to be filled out when you're writing the offer. And then you're going to have the buyer's going to sign it here, and then seller's going to sign it again after the buyer. Let's see, I don't think I highlighted anything here, but so the seller's going to specify what all the different fees are, if there is a special assessment or not. Now, they might fill this out at one point, and then property's on the market for a few months, and then you have a contract. So I'd still want to compare these against what's in the condominium documents when you get them, just to make sure. They have to say whether a special assessment or not. And once again, once I get the condo docs or co-op docs, I want to double check, see if there is or is not a special assessment. They have to specify whether parking space is deeded with the property, is it taxed separately or not, same as storage unit. And just like in Virginia, the buyer has, once they get the condominium documents, they have 3 days to review them, and they can cancel a contract for any reason. Here's the right to cancel. Oh, 3 business days. So this is one example where it's not calendar days, but it's business days. So that's good to keep in mind. And in DC, the seller has to issue the condo docs within 10 days, 10 business days. And if not, the buyer can void the contract. Now the co-op resale addendum kind of works the same way. One thing that's different is with co-op, sometimes there's an underlying mortgage. So they have to specify that, how much the payment is, principal and interest.
What is an underlying mortgage?
Well, sometimes co-ops will, if they have a major repair or capital improvement they want to make, they will take out a mortgage on the building rather than a special assessment. They can take out a underlying mortgage that all owners have to make payment towards. So when a co-op owner sells, that underlying mortgage conveys with the property.
Is that like a second mortgage?
Not exactly. I mean, it is an additional mortgage, but it's a mortgage held by the co-op, where when you talk about a second mortgage, that's held by the actual owner.
Okay.
And just like in a condo, they have the buyer has a right to cancel if they find something in there they don't like. Yeah, I could spend a whole class on condo and co-op documents. But here it says here, buyer has the right to cancel in 3 business days. What else we got? Talk about that, condo and co-op. HOA is going to look very similar to condo. I have to specify whether there's any special assessments. Talk about parking and storage. And also the buyer has 3 business days to cancel once they get the condo, once they get the documents. Okay, the last couple forms, we have a pre-settlement occupancy addendum. The one thing I'd say about this is avoid it if you can. As a listing agent, I can't think of a situation where I'd let the seller, where I'd let a buyer move in before settlement. You're just asking for trouble if something goes wrong, or if they get into the property and then they start finding any other things wrong with it, and then they want to back out of the contract, and then they move in and they lose their job and they lose their financing. It's just asking for trouble. So avoid these if you can. I think there's more risk on the seller side. So if you're working with a buyer and seller's willing to, that's a different matter. Post-settlement, that's a little bit more common. Initially the post-settlement was, if the seller needs to stay a few days so they can pack up and move to their next place. But then when the market went crazy, sellers were taking 30, 60 days and staying there for free. So a couple important things to point out. You want to, as far as the fee you're going to charge them, the seller's going to pay the buyer. Only check one of these. Don't check all 3, because then it's confusing exactly what is the cost. So if you want to charge carrying costs, it has a formula here how they compute it, or you can just have a flat fee, hey, $5,000 for the month. That's it. But just check one of those. If the seller fails to vacate, then the fee shall be doubled, or X amount per day. So if you lend them a say for free for a certain period, make sure you write in a certain amount here to give them incentive to move. And just like a regular rent, you know, you want to charge security deposit. I think 1 month of what a typical rental would be fair. Property condition. So this is an important one because you know, it's saying that seller agrees to deliver the property, just like at a normal walkthrough on settlement. They got to deliver it vacant, clear of trash and debris, broom clean, and a condition required under contract, which mean on the settlement day. So what this also means is if you're, you know, if the seller's staying in the property beyond settlement date, and let's say the dishwasher breaks, one typical landlord-tenant relationship, the landlord would be responsible for that. But that's not how this works. For a post-settlement occupancy agreement, it's the seller who's staying there, they're responsible for that. They would have to fix that. And you want to check, if you're gonna be doing these, you also want to check, both the buyer and the seller, you want to check with their have them check with their insurance companies to make sure they have the proper insurance in place. Not every insurance will cover this. You know, especially the buyer, they want to have their hazard insurance in place and make sure they can cover it when somebody else is living there. It also specifies, well, settlement agent and all the other agents. You know, this is really a contract between the buyer and the seller. So try not to get mixed up in any disputes with this. Also, it says in bold type here, buyer and seller shall confirm with their respective insurers that proper coverage is obtained. And this is not a lease, so no landlord-tenant relationship is created. The last form I have is for FSBO, authorization to show and agreement to pay and buyer and broker commission. So if you're going after FSBOs, you want to have the seller sign this before you actually show it. Because what you don't want to have happen is you show it, there's no agreement in place to pay your commission, and you don't have anything signed with the buyer, and the buyer goes behind your back and makes a deal with the seller. So get this in place and make sure you get paid. And I think that is it. So that's all I got. So if you want a copy of this presentation and all the other, so this PowerPoint and this document here, tell me one thing you learned and send me an email to rick@kwmetrocenter.com. So anybody have any questions over anything we covered? And it sounds like no. So I'm going to end this now. Have a good day. Feel free to reach out anytime with questions.
Can I, yes, can I?
Yep.
You say you can send the list of things, or these, or maybe we should just see the recording. I don't know.
Yeah, send me an email, tell me one thing you learned, and I'll send you a copy of this
Okay.
PowerPoint and the contract.
Alrighty. Thank you. Thank you, Rick.
Okay,
Have
have a good
a
day.
good one. Thank you, you too.
All right.